Hi, I'm Dubber, I'm the Director of Music Tech Fest, and this is the MTF podcast. When MTF moved its base from the UK to Sweden a few years ago, we worked closely with what has now become RISE, the Research Institute of Sweden. That's where I first met Anette Novak, who was the National Research Agency's CEO for 5 years. She's now the Director General of the Swedish Media Council, the governmental agency in charge of empowering children and youth to navigate an increasingly complex media landscape, both online and off. That organisation's role says a lot, not only about the changing nature of media in general, but also about Sweden itself. I met up with Anette over coffee in her office at the Film Institute in Stockholm and had what was, for me, a fascinating and in-depth conversation. We talked about why Sweden has zero censorship, none at all, how technologies like facial recognition, AI, and immersive games raise ethical rather than moral questions, and the sheer degree of high-level research that goes into fostering a healthy, curious, and literate society. Hope you enjoy. Annette, you're the Director General of the Swedish Media Council. What does that mean?
That means that I lead a national authority or agency who has the government's instruction to empower young people and children when it comes to giving them the tools and the perspectives, the awareness to be able to navigate a more and more complex media landscape. We also are supposed to protect, which is a more difficult term, I would say, and something that we have a difficult relation to, that term. But we do that through the assessment of films, where we put age limits on films, which is, I would say, it's the remnant of what used to be the Swedish censorship. But there's no more censorship, but there is at least this proactive sifting of not wanting to expose the really young children to the very violent content.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but what I'm really interested in is your journey, because this is not a logical next step in your career, because your background is research and innovation, and how do those things? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you were doing before you did this?
So I'm a journalist from background and training, and my whole career has been within digital transformation, I would say. Well, mainly the last 10-15 years of my operative career within media was within digital transformation, which led me to dig deeper and deeper into what drives innovation, what blocks organizations and industries from wanting to innovate, from wanting to transform. And then eventually I was headhunted to this position as CEO of the Research Institute RISE Interactive, which works with applied ICT and design research. And that was also a kind of a sidestep from what I had been doing, but I saw media as one of the application areas in which you could apply these experimental theories or whatever. It's not even theories, it's like we build things very much like you do to try and understand what happens when we try and build this, and how can we incorporate that into daily activity. So as from there, I was also parallelly working with the governmental inquiry into the media landscape. So my relationship to working for the government started there, and so I was assigned by the Ministry of Culture to do this big inquiry, which I did for almost 2 years. And having left that, one of the major conclusions of that work was, with all that's going on in the media landscape, hate, algorithms that filter our realities so we no longer have the same picture of reality, we need, the only thing that would sustainably address this is education. And then, so I wrote in that conclusion that we need a massive national movement towards strengthening media and information literacy in the Swedish population. And since that was part of my conclusions, when I got the question if I wanted to do this, and this is doing operationalization of that suggestion, it's like, okay, what if you would do it? How would you do it? Here you have an agency. Think about how you would do it.
So you're having to implement your own recommendations.
That's where I am now. Not really doing my own recommendations, but we got a special assignment also at the same time as I started, which was how can we find a methodology that would strengthen the coordination of, because many people are into this area, but it's not coordinated. So there has been a huge work done into looking into what's going on within media and information literacy in Sweden. And from there we can just withdraw that it's very fragmented and therefore not as strong as it could be if it was more coordinated. And we got the assignment to try and see, is there any way we could play a role in coordinating this in a way so that we could make this happen much faster, because the need is out there and everybody has seen it now. So to me, it's not that much, back to your question, not that much of a side move, but actually a very logic from the inquiry's conclusions, where they said, okay, you talked about it in theory, we saw the need, let's do it, but how should we do it? Because it's not an easy task, of course.
What does media mean in the context of the Swedish Media Council? Obviously, there's film ratings and that, but media, in my head, is it's VR, it's AR, it's games, it's music, it's radio, it's
it's very wide.
Does that encapsulate everything within the Swedish Media Council?
I would say that we're. I mean, I started 2 months ago, so one of my first, of course, discoveries is that a lot of the legislation that we depend on or that frame our work is very limited to the old legislation, and Swedish media legislation is very channel oriented, very technically bound, which is the case I think in many European countries. And we need to get, that was also a conclusion from the media inquiry, that we need to release ourselves from those boundaries and become like technologically agnostic, so that we can start talking about the effects of media on relationships and realities and the social contract, instead of just being blocked into how do we transmit television programs to the audience. That's not interesting anymore, and less. But I think the legislator is lagging behind, unfortunately.
This notion of media effects is really interesting. It's been really controversial since the 1940s, the sort of Lazarsfeld stuff and all that.
Yep.
And, is there this kind of perception within Sweden particularly that if you show people violent things, they become violent themselves? Or is it more sophisticated than that?
Well, I would say if you go to science, I mean, we have scientists looking at these things. There's no evidence of what you just said. There's no evidence that says that there is a causality between those things. We know that you can see that there's a relationship between, but there's no research that has shown that if you look at violent programs, you become violent. We know that there is a higher degree of violent people playing violent games, but we don't know why, if it works both ways. So there's there's no proof of that, I would say.
And
all.
Presumably, I mean, you said protecting young children particularly. Presumably that's more to do with trauma than...
The way we in practice have interpreted this, and I should be really careful now because I've only been here 8 weeks, and these are people who've been working with this for decades, so I mustn't say anything that they would say this is wrong. But I think that Sweden very much so is not, some countries in the world bring in morality into this, and Sweden has definitely not done that. We know that there are extremely violent scenes can hurt children under certain ages, even if they just see them once. Others, it's a question of how repetitive it is. Like, for instance, if we would say, take the image of the very thin woman. That doesn't hurt a child if it sees it once, but if a young woman has seen only those images for a very long time during her whole childhood, it will skew her image of what is normal. So it's not as binary, it's very many nuances to this discussion. But if I should say anything short about it, Sweden, of course, wishes to protect children from damage, as we should as parents and caretakers, or whatever you want to call it. We want to take care of our younger generations without stifling any freedom that they might have, and this is a very difficult balance, to not blocking them from having access to information, which is access to information legislation is part of Swedish constitution since the 18th century. So it's extremely important to weigh those against each other. And I think that we are rather unique in the world with the other Nordic countries to not bring in morality questions into this. We show a lot of nudity even into younger children. We don't see that as problematic. It's natural. How people look, it's something, and what people do when they're naked. It's not something that we put any. It's about parental guidance, of course, and that's why we have. There's been a new twitch to the Swedish legislation recently, where we say we can put a lower age limit, but then say together with your parent, in order to also say that this is not, the state shouldn't enter into this discussion that much. It's more about maybe a child. It's very individual also, how a child, it's about what the child's capacity and what it has experienced personally that will make it very difficult to say something general about how a certain movie scene will affect a certain person. But a parent has definitely a role to play in catching any thoughts or debriefing reactions that might occur.
Are you distinguishing morality from ethics? For instance, if you talk about social media, as we did before we started this conversation, about the idea of forming sort of ethical parameters within which people can do things with personal information and those sorts of things. So there's no morality dimension to the Swedish legislation, but is there an ethical dimension to it?
I would say that, first of all, it's important to say that I'm a non-political civil servant here, so I can tell you how the Swedish legislation looks like. And one aspect that we do have is, of course, that there is an ethical, scientific ethical committee that if there's anything that should be weighed ethically, that the researcher considers could have ethical challenges to it. It needs to pass that type of scrutiny before you're allowed to start, which of course in certain I would say academic disciplines, like let's take design, it is difficult because part of it is actually doing something new that hasn't happened before. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation sometimes, like doing design within, let's say, patient experience within an actual environment makes it very difficult when you have that type of framework. Another part of that is, of course, that we're part of the European Union, and the Swedish position at the moment is very much that one wants to work together with European partners. In order not to, if you want to keep Europe together, it's very important that is not always drawn apart in each question that we deal with. And that's been the current, or the past, now we're waiting for a new government, but the past government's position has been very much so that we act within the European Union in these questions. So GDPR, of course, is one of the legislations coming out of this type of discussion, and where the intent of the legislator, of course, is to strengthen the user's control and awareness. Now one can, of course, have a lot of views on such a young legislation and how it will be interpreted. We don't really know yet. There has been no rulings that would be guiding us to understand how it will be interpreted by the courts. But I think that the movement, of course, if we look at from our agency's point of view, where about the empowerment of the user, of course, any legislation that will assist the user in giving them the mandate to be how can I say, more aware of how they, as media users, can be exploited and what they can do about it. It's moving in the right direction.
You talked before about media literacy being very important, and particularly around education. And I know most legislators internationally, when they talk about media literacy, they mean the ability to read, and not necessarily the ability to write. And so this idea of literacy I find really interesting, because the way in which we communicate, the way in which we use these tools, not just to take in information, but to express ourselves, I think is very important. And the maturity of a media format is the extent to which you start to get a literature in that. Are we seeing any new literatures coming in new media?
It's a really good question, but I would say that media information literacy is an extremely wide area, and it's widening as we speak, because it's also about digital contents. It's about understanding power logics, business logics within the digital landscape. It's about understanding how technology can skew perceptions, can skew what your perception of reality is, or your perception of a material. In Sweden, we talk a lot about the extended definition of reading, where reading today is also understanding a picture, or the movie, meeting the movie and the moving pictures, and many things more. It's the gaming world and the immersive worlds that the children meet, or even us, of course, as adults. So media and information literacy, to me, it's more it's an area which has a lot of traction at the moment, but a lot of the people who are in, I would say, the debate don't understand how wide it is. I think teachers and librarians that I meet, they talk a lot about source criticism, which is good, but source criticism in their interpretation is very much leaning towards the old media landscape. Source criticism today means that you have to understand that the certain data sources are owned by big conglomerates, that the data you see is been filtered in a way that you don't understand and you don't know, and it has business logics in it. One talks a lot about that the platform companies, they give you the user experience that you want, but you don't make informed choices. It's something that you don't. There's no transparency into how the algorithms work. All these things are something that a aware media consumer needs to learn. And if you don't know, and if you don't learn these things, you cannot be. I would claim that you will not be able to exercise your citizenship. You can easily become a useful idiot of someone. And I think, unfortunately, that some of the forces that is moving the world at the moment is way ahead of the democratic forces who wants the citizens to be empowered in this sense. They're making a lot of money on it. and of course that's why it's important that we that represent democratic states, and they're in those positions, we want to guard the common good, if I may say so. It's a big word, but still some kind of idea of, we're doing this for you guys. We want to have expertise so that we can try and make you understand what you need to learn.
Is there a potential for that to impede innovation in any particular way? I mean, are there things that aren't being developed because there is this kind of caution about effects or those sorts of things, or that's not your experience?
I think that there some of the technologies that are being invented as we speak, and I think what you might find a good example is the facial technology, facial recognition technologies, and for instance, in that sphere, the companies in the Occidental world, they face, of course, directly, as soon as they show what they can do, they will face a debate on, is that good? Should we do that? And on the ethical committees and all that, which of course stalls, or at least reduces the speed of our innovation capacity, where the states that only see what it can be used for, and they don't have any ethical argumentation, because that doesn't enter into their world picture, they will fund those companies very strongly and just let them move ahead and of course then block the technology within the state. So they will, technology wise, they will win, and I would say that they are winning the race at the moment because of this. However, I think that in the long run, I don't believe that I always believe that love will conquer hate, and that freedom will conquer control in the long run. But I think within the short term that we can overlook at the moment, the negative forces, the anti-democratic forces using technology against the populations are winning at the moment.
Democracy is losing the battle, but you don't think the war?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. The little battles at the moment, but I think the war is about the citizenship and freedom, and that is stronger forces in the long run. And technology, I think also that the democratic powers are stronger, and but they've been behind in this because they haven't seen how they can exploit this, and they're not organized together. Because that's part of democracy. It should be fragmented. There should be lots of different ways of seeing things, and freedom of speech makes those voices very fragmented, whereas the anti-democratic forces have been able to organize themselves, and thus they have moved ahead for a while.
This whole area of media and technology and content, if you like, and literacy and that, it touches on art, it touches on science, it touches on policy, industry,
design,
research, all of these things.
Yeah.
How well do those things work together, or are you having different types of conversations in different spheres?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's about. I think it's. Definitely, you know the answer yourself. It's about we are in silos, and academia is in silos, governments are in silos, and the future is more matrix networked and flatter organizations. So there is a challenge here, which we have to be able to overbridge if we have to do something about this. But there's also the difficulty coming from innovation. In innovation, you don't want to, if you have a research institute which is, let's say, focused on AI, they want to have deep knowledge on AI. They don't want to use half of their work time to coordinate with others because they lose a lot of the edge that they have. So there's also, it's not as easy to say, let's change the silos for the matrix and the network. It's much more complicated than that. But it's a shift in I would say, in world history, where we need to understand how we're going to do that transformation without losing the speed in the edge of each area. And that each area should be pure in their thinking and still be able to communicate with the others. But I believe that media, to go back to your very initiated question on media definitions, which are not adequate the way the legislation is written today, very often attached to the old distribution techniques, where we need to find new media definitions, which and media in a sense also, if Mark Deuce says we live in media life, I mean, how can media at all be used, I would say, in a future where everything is media, where everything is connected and everything is part of the same world? I think that's difficult, but how to move the silos into working together in more cross-disciplinary means and groups. I think that's we have been working in those environments, all of us, I think, and there's a strength in that. There's a tremendous strength in moving the thought when you get inspiration from many different areas, but to create sustained activities, like, for instance, let's go back to media and information literacy. It's easier to do that in a project organization where you do project, you can close it down, you do something else. When the state has decided that the population needs to lift its understanding within this domain, it's something that has to be sustained over generations. It has to have a structure. And I think that's something that I'm thinking a lot about these days, like how can we take the best out of the cross-disciplinary agile organizations, but still not lose the sustained effort and the long-term, the 50-year planning horizons and things like that you have to deal with when you deal with population education. 50
years is a long time. You've been doing this 2 months. How will you know you've done a good job?
Oh God, that's a very difficult question. I hope that we can be a facilitator to create a movement where a lot of actors start moving in the same direction. I don't think that we can. Coordination is no longer about putting everybody together and synchronizing and becoming efficient. It's about finding ways to create movements where many different from different disciplines, from different agencies, from different whatnot, that we actually move in the same direction. That we see the same picture of the success, which is media and information literacy. What is that? What do we need to know in the future in order to not break down the landwinnings of democracy? I mean, we are one of the, when it comes to media legislation, I think we have the oldest freedom of expression legislation in the world from 1766. Let's not break that down. How can we mold that into the digital current and future without losing what we've gained so far of knowledge? Because that's what's happened, I think, in this. It's like a bump on that. That's what I would like to be a little part of doing.
Annette, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Anette Novak, Director General of the Swedish Media Council. And that's the MTF podcast. If you have any thoughts about any of this, and that is the whole reason we do this, please do give us a shout. We're Music Tech Fest on Twitter, Music Tech Fest on Facebook, Music Tech Fest on Instagram, and Music Tech Fest on LinkedIn. And I'm Dubber at musictechfest.net if you want to drop me a note and say hi. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, please do. And also, take a moment to send this on to the one person you think should really hear it. We'd really appreciate it, and so will they. All the best, and have a great week. Cheers.